as you were describing, Rhonda, the kind of enter this and enter that, and, our very interdependent, interconnected world, I was reminded of, the beloved, one of the beloved pioneers of the socially engaged Buddhism movement, who coined the term engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about interbeing.
Interbeing.
Sometimes he'll say interbe, to actually interbe. With
we enter R.
We enter R, yeah. And
exactly.
so it might be helpful. I think you've done a good job of defining engaged mindfulness as socially engaged mindfulness. I'd like to just say a couple of other things, not to limit the term, but some people, engaged Buddhism kind of stuck. That was the originally term. Some of us preferred using socially engaged Buddhism because we didn't want to imply that there were non-engaged Buddhists.
Right.
And the same thing with mindfulness. So maybe socially engaged mindfulness is a better term. But whether we're talking about engaged mindfulness, or as you said, community engaged mindfulness, or socially engaged mindfulness, for me, it has a lot to do with bringing mindfulness to those parts of our society that are under-resourced, underrepresented, where people are falling through the cracks, where there's a lot of suffering. Now, at the same time, and sometimes in talking about, again, socially engaged Buddhism, I've often said there are kind of two aspects to it. One is ministering to the suffering that's there. So can we bring contemplative practices, or can we ourselves be contemplative in the way we help others, right? So can we offer practices that would be helpful in healing to others, or do those practices help us to be more helpful in healing to others? So that's the ministry quality. And then there's the more witnessing social justice, social change, economic justice, environmental justice, that whole aspect, actually systems change, trying to actually change some of the structures that are producing so much suffering. And they're both very important. Ministering to the suffering that's right there in front of us right now, and then working to change some of the structures that are perpetuating suffering, right? So the same thing with engaged mindfulness. I think it has both those aspects. We're training teachers to be more effective in helping others, whether it's in the prison systems or homeless shelters or shelters for abused women or at-risk youth facilities and so forth, to have their own mindfulness practice, help them be more effective and to sustain their work. So because of the danger of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, where we're working around individuals with a lot of trauma, we can take it on if we don't have ways to work with it. And also it just helps us be more present, more effective, and more skillful in so many ways. And then also, where appropriate, to offer the practice of mindfulness in some way or another that might be helpful to an individual to help them with their own healing. So there's that whole aspect. And then there's the whole part you were mentioning, the witnessing. And I think that that's so important. And it's been part of many different religious traditions and secular traditions, this idea of not turning away. For me, my own background with the Zen peacemakers has been very important. We talk about not knowing, bearing witness, and then loving action, compassionate action. That idea of bearing witness is that idea of we're willing to hang in there and face the tough things. And Buddhist Peace Fellowship, a very venerable, socially engaged Buddhist or mindfulness organization, put out a book a number of years ago. I was very proud to have a chapter, and they called it Not Turning Away. And I've always loved that title. And so I think, one thing about mindfulness, it can, for me, it kind of, one of its great gifts is helping us realize that interdependent, interconnected world that we're part of, and that's in so many different ways, right? To realize that and feel that, begin to have that separateness dissolve somewhat. And at the same time, being able to hold our experience somewhat lightly, reflectively, and also to develop the resilience to do that tough work, the resilience to not turn away, the resilience to look at ourselves in the mirror, the resilience to look at the tough societal issues, the resilience to look at how acutely some of these systems are disproportionately and tragically affecting certain communities. So it takes strength and resilience to look at that, right? Because instinctually, as human beings, and we can have compassion for ourselves, instinctually we want to turn away. We want to protect our hearts. We want, that's painful, it's hard, right? And I don't think we have to feel bad about that. It's a natural instinct. But with mindfulness, we can develop, I think, the courage and the resilience to look and to not turn away. And also to be able to remain compassionate with ourselves and others while we're doing so, and at the same time being brave and honest to see the truth.
Absolutely.
So maybe that's a landscape of engaged mindfulness, but at the same time, I wouldn't limit it. I've thought of, there could be a term, maybe applied mindfulness, right? So, I mean, there's mindfulness, but it's basically my own personal mindfulness practice. I practice it. It's helpful to my spiritual life, my physical health, my mental, emotional, and spiritual health. It's just really good for me, right? And then there's taking mindfulness into the world. So there's a lot of work now taking mindfulness into the mainstream, into the corporate world. Well, I might not normally place that under what I'm thinking of as socially engaged mindfulness, right. But certainly those folks need help.
Right.
Our corporations would become a little more mindful, not just higher performing through mindfulness, but a little more mindful in the sense of recognizing the interconnectedness. Maybe mindfulness is a Trojan horse that'll help our corporations that have such a huge impact on all of us.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll help them become a little more liberated. So I don't know where to draw the lines exactly, but for now, I think it has something to do with addressing suffering and also being willing to witness to these structures that are creating disproportionate suffering in our society for so many.
Yeah, and as you're alluding to when you talk about, the question of whether or not this applies to the work, for example, to bring mindfulness into corporations and corporate settings, seeing that there is a way that this could be considered either applied mindfulness or socially engaged mindfulness of a sort. To me, it's really about realizing that suffering is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And the social is everywhere. There is a justice dimension, which I think implicit in the way you're describing socially engaged mindfulness, that is to say the idea of taking it to marginalized and traditionally underserved communities and populations and trying to alleviate suffering in those settings. That to me is about making a link between what we're talking about and specific projects that I would put under the rubric of social justice, in the sense that what we're doing is we're looking at bringing mindfulness and compassion practices specifically to bear on the kinds of what I would call and I and others call, John Powell uses this phrase as well. We call it surplus suffering. That is to say, in addition to just sort of existential suffering that comes with, reckoning with, the human condition. Exactly.
I usually refer to it as unnecessary suffering.
Right. It's this kind of suffering that comes out of structures, institutions, often which link social identity, biases, and privileges with differences or differential access to power. So that if one is operating from a place of bias, preference for one group or another, and has the kind of power or positionality that enables one to participate in systems, help shape systems which, distribute resources or, kind of orient organizations toward the application of punishment, to speak from my place connecting with law and criminal justice as you do. So that when I speak about social justice, I'm specifically looking at efforts to alleviate that kind of surplus or additional suffering that can come from, I would say, maybe maldistributions of power, the way in which, again, power can be abused and can lead to individuals and communities just suffering more than is sort of a part naturally of the human condition. Mm-hmm. And so that to me is a particular variant, for me anyway, of socially engaged mindfulness, because it is putting that particular emphasis on trying to address, again, that surplus or extra suffering, unnecessary suffering that we can see around us if we're willing to open our eyes and really turn toward, with compassion for ourselves, as you say, in the process, see it, not turn away from it, deal with all the kind of often underappreciated emotional and other dynamics that go, as you alluded to, that run with our patterns and conditionings around living with the suffering of others, right? I mean, there's some way in which our society here in the US and societies across the world tend to manifest all kinds of hierarchies and normalization of the kinds of suffering, the patterns that we're talking about. So, part of the project that moves for me in some kind of fluid interconnectedness. Again, we often identify these separate domains, my own personal mindfulness practice, and then we got the socially engaged or applied, and then the, trying to change the systems. To me, we're all always already in all of those. And so bringing awareness to who it is that we are when we seek to, quote unquote, help others or offer services to others that we think might be of benefit. How we realize that really our destinies are intertwined, and in that sense we are in, sort of my sense of safety or privilege is in some really essential fundamental way tied to somebody else's sense of insecurity and vulnerability. And so that's the sort of subtle, I think, kind of opening up to the way in which who we are and how we are in the world can assist us in the work of, specific projects around helping alleviate specific types of suffering in our midst, whether it be hunger or violence or immigration vulnerability, right? We are seeing particular manifestations of kinds of suffering that we want to kind of come in and try to offer support to individuals who are suffering in those situations. We also, though, at the same time, are part of these systems that are creating and normalizing that kind of suffering. And to me, again, as you talk about it, it's really not easy. We have to have compassion if we're going to invite ourselves and others into a really deepening engagement with what it means to really, again, really meet our conditioning, our habits and patterns, the habits we've all grown up with to varying degrees, that really make it okay to walk past, to know that there will be communities over there that are suffering in a way that communities over here aren't, or to walk past people who are homeless and know that there's homelessness that's sort of happening in our society. Something has allowed vast numbers of us to normalize that. And so I think part of the work of socially engaged mindfulness, or really just mindfulness as applied, as you say, in all of these various dimensions, whether it be in communities that are struggling or corporations or wherever we are. Mm-hmm. The question for me is, what kind of suffering might be being created and named or not named here? What are the dimensions of that? The interpersonal, the personal, and then the systemic pieces. So obviously corporations create, in a certain sense, certain kinds of suffering. I speak from my own experience, for example, in legal services corporations or law firms, where you can see the kinds of stress and pressures that people experience on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. But then also, who are the clients? What kind of work are they doing in the world? Are there ways that the actual work that a law firm's clients, corporations are doing, are there ways that we can really turn a little bit more toward the interconnection between what it is that we're doing, for the legitimate purpose of making a good income for ourselves, trying to offer some product or service in the world? How might we also be more deeply engaged with, on a regular, ongoing basis, the question of whose suffering is not being acknowledged here? How are we turning toward and actually doing the difficult work of making commitments to try to minimize surplus suffering wherever it shows up? And to me, that's really at the heart of my own, what I would call mindfulness practice. So again, in that sense, I can separate it out into these various domains and talk about the different dimensions of it. But for me, at the very core of the practice has been this sort of unfolding engagement with my own being in a world.
Right.
I didn't create the world, but all of this is happening. Right. And the question is, how can I, more rightly and with integrity and with the support of that sense of deep interconnected and interbeing that does arise, at least for me, over, has arisen more and more over time, right? How can I live in a world and support others to actually live in this world in ways that reflect a deep desire that suffering in all its variations and dimensions just be minimized or tended to or held in a way that can help reduce it.